I will tell you also, we've got a special guest today, Robert Hilliker Jr., not senior, but junior. And he comes highly recommended from Matt, and he has a Chapelwood background and runs a ministry in town and has done a lot of work around addiction, correct? And so I think it's going to be really exciting. So you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Okay, we have a tradition in the crossing class. As you are able, stand up and give our guest speaker a standing ovation.
Well, thank you. Let's see if what I speak to warrants or deserves that, but but I like that we started with it, so thank you. So I'm Dr. Robert Hilliker. I'm a clinical social worker by training and about a 24-year friend of Matt's. I met him right here in this room that many years ago, about a year after he started Mercy Street. And Mercy Street was a really interesting place. I had grown up in an environment, and I won't name any names, but let's just say I'm a recovering Baptist. And so I grew up in this environment that I think in a lot of ways for me was deeply spiritually wounding. And I was wounded in the name of God, which I think is a really challenging thing to get over. And it was Matt who sort of helped me reimagine what that relationship with a higher power could be by creating a space that was open enough to really receive you wherever you were in your spiritual development and your journey. And so the thing that got me about Mercy Street was those wanted posters with Jesus on it. And it said he had long hair, he lived at home till he was 30, and he got in trouble with the law. He's our kind of guy. And I don't know if he still has those, if those are floating around anywhere. I saw one of them a while back. He sent it to me. But that did it for me. I was like, all right, I can do that. So I'm going to talk to you guys about some things. There's a number of folks that I know, and if you spend enough time with me, you recognize that I've got a few tricks in my bag, and that's about it. And so some of you guys that have known me for a while may go, oh, Robert's talked about this before, but hopefully it's novel to some of you. So I wanted to talk about a handful of things, and we'll see how much I can get through. The first, many of you might know Richard Rohr, really important figure in that he's a Franciscan, which is sort of like they occupy the outside of the inside edge of the church, and everything they say is just about heretical, but they're still inside the church, and I like that. Richard Rohr has written a number of books, and one of them is called Adam's Return, and it's about initiatory rites of passage. But one of the things, there's 5 points that I want to speak to, and I'm gonna preface this by saying they're all kind of a bummer. But so I'm gonna give them to you, and then we're gonna walk through them. Life is hard. You're not important. This life is not about you. You're not in control. And you're going to die. So like I said, real bummer of a talk. So let's start with the first one. Life is hard. So I'm lucky enough to be married with a partner I love very, very much, and she and I have 5 daughters, which is amazing. Yeah. It's amazing. So they're aged 11, 9, 7, 4.5, 1.5. So I've spent the last 11 years sleeping like a kidnapped journalist. And I was up at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 4 a.m., and 4:45. So if I speak in coherent sentences, this will be miraculous. So life is hard. Having 5 kids is hard. We elected that, that wasn't by accident, it was by design. Relationships are hard. Even when they're good, they're hard. But we live in a culture a culture of convenience that has sort of taught us, and I think led us really far astray. And for some reason or another, we often imagine that life shouldn't be hard. And I think as a result of that, we end up feeling quite stuck and feeling like we're supposed to be somewhere other than we are, or things are supposed to be easier than they are. And like I said, I'm happily married, very happily married, and it's still hard. it's really difficult to do relationships over time. It's really difficult to show up for your life and not just check out and numb out. And I think the extent to which we resist that, it creates suffering for us. And acceptance of that fact creates freedom. So if you want more interior freedom, I think one of the first steps in that is accepting that life is hard. And the second that we do that, we, I think, relinquish a lot of the resistance, a lot of the suffering that comes as a function of resistance. So the second point is that you're not important. Now, not understanding this, I think, is actually a function of our struggle to grow up. So every infant is a tiny little narcissist, right? And they're supposed to be. That's their job. They don't care about you. They don't care about your feelings. They care about being fed, being changed, being held, all that. They don't have the idea of the other because they are really at one with you. And so everything is just about meeting this infantile need. And that sort of what Freud called primary narcissism, some of us don't ever get over that. And so we build lives around that. We live in a culture that tells us that we're special. And we are, but not for the reasons that, not because we're different, better, or exclusionary. We're special because we are the same, right? That's what makes us special. And we're all made of the same stuff. That's what's special about us as humans, as living beings on this earth. So we misunderstand that, I think, a lot of times, and we end up becoming too focused on ourselves, how we're feeling. And this goes in line with the next point, which is that this life is not about you. So I want to take a little bit more time with this point. Many of you have heard me talk about, anybody that knows me has heard me talk about James Hollis, right? He's an intellectual crush of mine and somebody I really have loved and learned a lot from. And so what Jim says is that there are 6 stages to a rite of passage that all of us must go through. And actually, many of us go through many rites of passage over the course of our life. And the first stage of a rite of passage is separation, right? So if you think about this in indigenous cultures or tribal cultures, the boy or girl is unceremoniously ripped from the hearth of their parents' home and taken to the wilderness. That's separation, right? All of us had to leave home. The second piece is a ceremony of death. Now, in tribal cultures, this was often signified, with the loss of a digit or being suspended by hooks or some kind of physical mutilation of the body. Thankfully, I don't think that's necessary. Nobody's going to be mutilated or needs to be in order to facilitate this. But we do have to go through a ceremony of death. We have to recognize our own mortality as well as the death of things that we have clung to, right? So much of where we get stuck has to do with how hard we hold on to something and how unwilling we are to let it go in order to experience transformation. So the third stage is a ceremony of birth. So in that cycle of death and resurrection, which is really what Christianity is so focused on in terms of the story of Jesus, it's not suffering for the sake of suffering, it's suffering for the sake of salvation. So in order to experience this death, we also experience the other side of that, which is growth, renewal, and a birth that comes out of the ashes of that experience, right? And to contextualize this, all of us have had that, right? There's not a single person in here, I'm absolutely certain, who's not been wounded in some way. You'd hardly be a part of a faith community if you hadn't been wounded, right? Because you came here seeking refuge, seeking support, seeking community, seeking some way of understanding the suffering that you had experienced. And in that place of exploring your own suffering and the depth of that, you found a community of people that surround you with love, I hope, and understanding and support and a sense of belonging. And so that's the ceremony of birth. And we all have to go through this in a number of different ways. There are also teachings that we have to go through. This is the fourth stage of a rite of passage, is that we have to be taught. I learned about halfway through my doctorate, I learned a really important lesson that I wish I had understood earlier, which is that I really loved learning and I hated being taught. And it was a rough lesson. I got into it so much with one of my professors in my third year of my doctorate that they they were questioning whether that was the place for me. And as was I. And I realized that that if I was really going to learn, I'd have to be taught, and that would require humility and becoming teachable. So historically, these kind of teachings like in tribal cultures would have been, God and the cosmos, and it would have been the agricultural and hunting practices of a people, and it would have been the oral history and tradition of people. And for us, certainly in the line of work that I do in behavioral health care with mental health issues and substance use, the teachings are usually the soft skills that people did not get necessarily but needed desperately. So things like empathy, things like self-compassion, right? These are the teachings that I have. We have to go through an ordeal. This is the 5th stage of a rite of passage, an ordeal. And that process of an ordeal can look like many things, and often it's that difficult place where we grapple with some part of our experience. And I think this happens over and over and over again. The problem, and I think this is our big problem and why we get stuck with this lesson from Roar about this life is not about you, is that sometimes we just end up recreating and enacting the ordeal because we never get to that 6th and final stage where we understand the return. So when the boy or the girl becomes a man or a woman and is ready to come back and rejoin their community, it's because they understand their unique gift and contribution to the world. So that boy doesn't come down from the wilderness until he understands what his unique contribution is to his community, right? So children take things, right? That's their job. We're not faulting them for that. That's their job. They take things. But adults give back. Adults learn how to be in service to other people. And if we don't learn that lesson that this life is not about us, and we don't learn how to serve, and we don't live into our gifts, which is to be the full measure of yourself, right? So I can tell you everybody's gift here is to be uniquely and completely yourself, right? You're the only you that contributes to this planet in the way that you do. So living into whatever that is for you, right, is your gift and contribution to your community. And if you don't do that, right, then you stay stuck in this ordeal. And then life is a crisis after crisis, being stuck over and over and over again. So this next piece, you're not in control. Well, let me say this also about that final stage of the return. One other thought on that, which is that Hollis calls this a heroic summons. That to show up to your life in that way is an act of heroism. And to give yourself over to a process of transformation is a heroic act. Now, for those of you that are familiar with the hero's journey, it is not about ascension, right? That's the lie that our culture has told us, is that growth and development looks like this. It looks like some unrealistic trend where we go from bottom left to top right without any dips in between, and that's a lie. In fact, it's quite the opposite, that the hero's journey and the summons that we're called to is a descent into darkness. And it's there in that darkness that we find a transformative experience that allows us to emerge with new understanding about ourselves and the world around us. And so even the answering the call to this heroic summons just puts us back at a level set, but with a new understanding, right? So there's this old adage about what's the difference between a monk and an enlightened monk. The monk chops wood and carries water, and the enlightened monk chops wood and carries water, right? It's really, there's nothing about the work that changes. It's actually an internal process where we're transformed. So you're not in control. Another truth that we resist, another lie that our culture sells us. But again, and this is a saying some of you might be familiar with, whatever you resist persists. So anything that you have resistance around will continue to show up in different ways, right? They may have a different face and a different name, but the same person with the same relational struggle will cross your path until you learn how to face it in a new way, until you surrender and give yourself over to that process, and until you realize that you are not in control. So in that, there's this really enticing thing, and again, Roar talks about this in a different book where he talks about the idea of the Limonoid. Many of you, maybe you've heard Matt talk about the liminal space, that space in between. And so when you relinquish control and you let go of the idea of certainty, which is also a falsehood, the only certainty is our next point, which is that you're going to die. Really cheerful, sorry. None of us get out of this alive. Shocking fact, I know. But, so the limonoid versus the liminal. The liminal is that space between. When I let go of the idea of being in control, I can move into that place. Bill Curley calls it the no longer and the not yet. And it's where I've let go of the old and I have a willingness to engage in the uncertainty of the future. And that's where change can occur. But a lot of us have created this, what Rohr calls the limonoid. The limonoid, the way I like to think about it is it's the difference between being an apple and having a picture of an apple, right? Having an apple and having a picture of an apple, right? Some of you have heard me speak to this. Most of us spend the first part of our lives, this is the so-called midlife crisis, right? Is that we've built most of our lives drawing a wonderfully realistic picture of an apple. We've got all, on its face, it looks like the juiciest, best apple ever. But it has no juice, it has no flesh, it doesn't satiate because it's flat and it's empty and it's not real, right? It's the picture of an apple versus an apple. And what we're trying to do, I think, from midlife on for most of us, if we've engaged in a process of development and learning in this way, is that we're letting go of the picture of the apple, the life we thought we were supposed to have, and embracing the reality of the apple. And it's much more satiating. So the fifth point in this is that you're going to die, right? A reality that none of us deny. I don't think anybody in here thinks they're going to live forever. But few of us actually contemplate that. And as a result, we persist in behaviors that no longer serve us, that we've outlived the utility of a long time ago. And we long for certainty, but we avoid the certainty that is death. And so my question to you guys, and something I hope that you'll take with you, is that if you really contemplated your own mortality and you saw it as imminent, would you live like you're living? Or would there be things in your life that you would radically change? So a few lessons about that all of this sort of culminate in for me, and I hope there are pieces that we can kind of carry away with us in this process. Well, I should ask Michelle for a time, so I know when I don't talk over my time boundary here. Yeah, I've got it now. I've got it.
So much time.
Yeah, good, perfect. All right, so that's the first question I'd really like you guys to contemplate is what would be radically different if you actually were aware and cognizant about your own mortality? What would you be doing differently? It's a question my wife periodically asks me. Hey, are you happy with this? Is this what you want to be doing? You know, and it's a really important question for me because sometimes I'm like, yes, and sometimes I'm like, no, because I'm a classic Enneagram 7, which I'll have to tell you a story about that. And you know, we Jeff and I were talking right before this, and we were talking about how Matt did Mercy Street, now he's doing the big church and blah blah blah. And Jeff said, "Yeah, it's so weird because Matt like never overcommits himself," and I was, he was being totally facetious, and I was like, "Yeah, that's why Matt and I are friends," and so. Classic Enneagram 7 stuff, which, by the way, years ago I sat down with Michelle and I said, we were talking about the Enneagram and doing some work around it, and I said, I really like being a 7. And she was like, oh, Robert. She was like, all 7s like their number. She was like, that's how we know you're a 7. They all like it. So I'm an enthusiast, and I like to take on more stuff. And so periodically when my wife asked me that question, I realized that I've committed to things that I don't really want to be doing, that don't fit with, that I've outlived the utility of, or that are more born out of my fear than the values I want to live into. And so I want to talk about that. So in order to live into being the full measure of ourselves, I think there's a handful of things that we need. There are many things, but here's a few of them. Our values have to be bigger than our fears, right? This is one I come back to over and over and over again, because many of us live a life governed by fear, and we're not even really aware of it. It's sort of background noise that we've become accustomed to, and we don't even really recognize it as such. But our values have to be bigger than our fears. And a good example of this, like for myself, for an Enneagram 7, is the idea of my fear of disappointing others can get me overcommitted in a way that's not consistent with my values. And then I'm compromising the integrity of what I want to live like because I'm scared of letting people down. That's, and maybe some of you can see yourself in that, and maybe you can recognize other fears that you have that get bigger than your values. But if we're going to live into the full measure of ourselves, our values must be bigger than our fears. Hollis also says that we have to vow to get unstuck, right? Many of you have heard that language. Anybody that has worked with me in any capacity over the years has heard me talk about the idea of being stuck. Hollis says that no matter where he speaks, anywhere in the world, no matter what the language is that they speak, everybody understands what it means to be stuck. And so we have to vow to get unstuck, namely from the complexes that keep us small. So what is a complex? A complex, Pittman McGehee describes it very simply that the Jungian idea of a complex is not this pathologizing idea, but a complex is a concentration of energy, right? So many of us have a concentration of energy and around which we get stuck. We get constellated around this energy and we become really stuck around it. So the most notable ones for any of us that all of us have to transcend are the mother complex and the father complex, right? Often called the father hunger, a longing for a father who couldn't show up in the way that we needed. That's usually the case, depending on the generation that you're from. That's especially true. And the mother complex, the reality is that all of us face that because all of us have to leave home. Remember, separation is an important rite of passage. We have to leave home. And in order to do that, we have to leave our mothers. And I can tell you, I've counseled many, many marriages where men have still not left their mother, and as a function of that, they can't be in the relationship with their wife completely. Because they're still so beholden to this idea of what their mother wanted for them. And all of us live in that. We live in the shadow of, Hollis also says we're big people doing, we're little people doing big people things. We're little people doing big people things. So we have, again, the Limonoid. We've created the picture of an apple. We all look like adults. Everybody in here looks very adult, right? But inside, we're driven by the messages and expectations of our childhood. And some of you say, oh, no, I rejected all of that. And what I would say is, then you're still living in relationship to it. If your life is an expression of rejecting your parents, then you're still trapped under the same notion as living along with what they wanted, right? Because you're still constellated around that. You haven't found yourself in that because you're still in a relationship to this dynamic. So we have to free ourselves from our parents in that way. Which does not mean, a lot of times that can, a spiritual teacher of mine many years ago said, when a boy becomes a man, he has to reject his father. But when he knows he's a man, it's when he recognizes that he is both his own man and his father's son. So when we leave our parents, we don't rebuke them, right? We just have to free ourselves to know that we're our own person and that simultaneously, right? And that's the measure of our emotional quotient. Our emotional intelligence is dependent on our ability to hold equal and opposing truths and know that they're both true at the same time. I am my own man, and I'm my father's son. Both are true. Another complex that I think is really interesting in our culture, and I think we're seeing it now with a younger generation as well that's growing into adulthood, is what's often called the puer complex. It's one of my favorites. Puer is like the Peter Pan. It's a Peter Pan complex. Lost boys that don't want to grow up. Lost boys that have not figured out that being a man will require letting go of playing all the time. it will require that they grow into themselves. And that can constellate around women as well. I'm just speaking in gender terms about the puer complex, but it certainly can be with women as well. So our process around that is we have to grow up. We have to let go of childish things and childish notions about who and how we'd like to be in the world, and we have to embrace that first point that I started with, which is that life is hard. That's the first step to being an adult, is the appreciation that life is hard. My children's life is easy, and that's great, and I'm glad for them. And at some point, it will get hard. And I hope that I've given them enough in the way of lessons that they can navigate that when it comes. So in all of this, the transcendence of a complex means that we have to activate within that which we did not receive from without. So we have to activate in us the thing we didn't get. And that is to appreciate that all of that exists in you, right? This is one of the great contributions that Jung made, was to think about the world and our place in it as being full of archetypal energies, that we have everything that we need already in us. And that's a really important lesson, and I think we've lost that lesson too along the way. Our culture tells us that if we buy this thing, if we do this thing, if we have this process, if we do this workout, then we'll have what it is that we need. And what I really want you to hear, if there was one thing that you took away other than contemplating your own mortality, it would be this. It would be that you have everything that you need for the journey that lies ahead. You're not broken. And that is the shadow archetype of how I was spiritually wounded in a different type of church, which is this idea that I didn't have it, right? That the divine presence of God did not reside in me. But that if I did enough and I worked hard enough and I wasn't, and I believed all the things, that it would be enough. And then maybe, just maybe, I'd make it to heaven. And I'm here to say I don't believe in that theological construct. I just don't. I've sat with too many people for too long to think otherwise. So my belief is that we have everything that we need already in us, and it's just about activating that. It's about finding that, getting in touch with that, and cultivating relationships that reflect that. Right? If your relationships aren't reflecting back to you that you've got everything that you need, I'd encourage you to look at getting some new relationships. Right? Which is not to say that you're without fault, right? The mirror image that's coming back to you should not be, you're great, right? This mutual adoration society that we have too. You're so wonderful, No, but you're very much human. You're very much human. Flaws and all, and you have everything that you need. Again, both those truths exist at the same time inside of us. So with that, my kind of final point here, because Matt goes, you have until 10:50 technically. He's like, I don't suggest talking past 10:45. He's like, nobody's listening after 10:45. Okay, fair enough. So it's 10:38. We've got time for one more big point. So we must live with purpose. So how do we discover our purpose? This is a huge question. It's a big existential quandary that people have. Like, how do I find meaning and purpose? And we try to, a lot of times we fill it with things or a role, and then all the expectations of that role. But really, it comes back to this point that I made earlier, which is that we have to have clarity in our values, right? So for me, the pathway to discovering our meaning and purpose in life is to be really clear about our values, to craft a meaningful vision for your future, to understand how that vision is articulated in a daily mission, the way that you actually occur in the world. And I like to think about a mantra as well, some way, some song that we carry in our heart, some way, some shorthand version of how we hold all of that. And so the reason this is so important is that we can judge our behaviors against these values, right? So when you have clarity in your values, you can look at your behavior day to day, and should. If I had one should, if I should on you about anything, it would be that you should get really clear about your values so that you can judge your behaviors on a day-to-day basis against that, right? Because otherwise you will be unconsciously dictated to by your fears. And it will eat your lunch and it will keep you really, really stuck. So if I'm clear that my values are love and kindness, those are two of mine in particular, I can judge my behavior against those values, for example. So I can say, man, if I show up in this way, is that reflection of my love and kindness or not? And then I get to make a choice. And that's also what it is to be an adult. We get to make conscious choices. My children do things completely on impulse. It's like, my 1.5-year-old just climbs on. I don't recall the other 4 kids before her being as death-defying as she is, but like, if you like the kind of just to give you a sense of what it is to be in my home, it's like joy and then sheer terror, because if you do not hear the child, something is happening, right? So I'm like, where is she? What is she on? And this morning it was the dining room table, and then somehow she pulled a bench up from the bathroom, hall bathroom, all the way to a kitchen counter and was running across the kitchen island. So, yeah. So that's happening right now, right? My wife is at home with that right now. She's like, "How long is this talk?" We've got to be clear about our values, or else we will live into our fears in a way that consumes us, right? And we get away from that a lot. And so the other kind of lesson in all of this is that we have to have a community. I don't think that we do alone very well. So much of what we're longing for, right? Human beings are social animals. We are hardwired for human connection. And when we feel really alone, we get really unwell, right? Think Unabomber. Think Ted Kaczynski. They're alone in a cabin, right? Solitude is one thing. We can see, all of us need solitude as well. We need quiet moments of contemplation. We need prayer. We need time that's set aside. But we have to be able to differentiate between solitude and isolation. And when you feel deeply alone and you feel deeply isolated, you will get sick. You will get unwell. And furthermore, even if you don't get unwell in the sense of like depression, you might get unwell in the sense of forgetting these important lessons, because life does become all about you, right? It's really easy to forget about others when you're only living by yourself. And so how do you get connected in community as a way of staying healthy, as a way of staying connected, and to have people who mirror back to you and reflect a deeper sense about who you are in the world, as well as who you want to be, right? I'm friends with Matt because he makes me a better person to be friends with him, right? He reflects back both the best parts of me as well as my shadow, right? We cast a shadow that's as long as our light. And if you don't believe that about Matt, just ask Michelle. we cast a shadow as long as our light. And so those of us that have a lot of light also cast a long shadow. And the work of being in a relationship with somebody like that is that my shadow, as best as I can, I try and hold it in front of me so it doesn't trip me from behind. So it's not that I have all of this figured out, or I have any less shadow, or Matt has any less shadow. It's just that we try and hold it in front of us. Some people, if you've come from a different church fellowship and you meet Matt, and I call Matt the pastor that cusses a lot, but if you meet somebody like Matt, and you're not used to that, some people are taken aback by that, right? people felt that way about Jim too, about Jim Jackson when he was here. Like people, just come right out and be like, "I'm an alcoholic." You're like, "Oh wow, okay." So we're doing that. So this is one of those places where we tell the truth. Okay, got it. And that makes people uncomfortable sometimes. But our job is to hold our shadow in front of us. And if we have a community that helps us do that, I think we will be healthier for it and better for it. So with that, it's 10:45, and I'm not going to keep you past because I trust Matt to know what he's talking about. So we'll wrap up here, and thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate being out, and thank you for listening. Thank you. Yeah.